thank you for this study in Joshua and how interesting it is to see what happened after Moses died on Mount Nebo and just what went on right after that. Just bless our conversation today. In Yeshua's name, amen. So the first thing I always like to do is talk about, review what happened last week. It's kind of like, whenever you're watching television, they always show you what happened last week. So does anybody, can anybody summarize in a sentence or two what went on with in Joshua chapter 9? Well, I can.
How many paid attention to Ralphie last week?
I'll summarize. In chapter 9, we had this interesting case where the Gibeonites put on old clothes and took old wineskins and moldy bread and came to the Israelites and said, "We're not from around here. We've been journeying from a long ways away, and I thought we might settle here and we'd like to have a peace treaty with you." And the Israelites didn't consult God, and they said, "Okay, fine, let's have a peace treaty." And then they come to find out that the Gibeonites weren't from a long way off, they were neighbors, and that they had done that in an effort to deceive them. And so I felt like we had a pretty good discussion about this idea of the Israelites were forced, if you will, were obligated to keep their end of the treaty even though they were led into it under deception. And this is just me talking, but I've been interested for the past week or so about how God certainly says that if you've made a commitment, even though you made it without a full understanding of what was going on, you still have to keep your commitment. And we all talked about how, well, heck, we could have just, they could have just nullified that by saying, you cheated, so it's the deal's off. But they didn't, and they went ahead and honored their commitment. So that's what we did last week, talk about the Gibeonites and their deceptive deal with the Israelites and the fact that the Israelites had to keep the deal, which they did, but they said, okay, you guys can be our neighbors, but you're going to haul wood for us. And what was haul wood and do something else?
Water,
wood and water. So they had a built-in group of slaves, I guess. Anyway, anybody have any thoughts about the Gibeonites before we go on to chapter 10? Okay. So I'd like to see if I can get someone to read Joshua chapter 10, the first 15 verses. Thank you, Jan, very much for volunteering.
Now Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and were living near them. He and his people, help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us. So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. Then Yahweh said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. Yahweh threw them into confusion before Israel, who defeated them in great victory at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, Yahweh hurled large hailstones down on them from the sky, and more of them died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. On the day that Yahweh gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to Yahweh in the presence of Israel, "O sun, stand still over Gibeon. O moon, over the valley of Ahialon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Yashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when Yahweh listened to a man. Surely the Yahweh was fighting for Israel. Then Joshua returned with all Israel to the camp at Gilgal.
Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll go back and look at this in detail so that we can dissect it and kind of see what was going on. I was able to find a map up here. So kind of to review, we know that the Israelites crossed the Jordan over here, and then they went over and we've read about how they took Jericho. And of course, after they took Jericho, their reputation was beginning to get well known. They were successful. And then they went over from Jericho to capture Ai, and we had the story of Achan and how Achan wasn't supposed to take stuff from the destruction of the village of Jericho and how he did. That's a very interesting story. But their first foray into Ai was not successful. But after they identified who had made the mistake and atonement was made, then they were able to take Ai, and they did that fairly quickly too. So now their reputation was even more, what do I want to say? They were even scarier to the Canaanites. And then we talked about what just happened with the Gibeonites. Gibeon is not far from Ai, okay? So the guy we talked about in the very first verse here is Adoni-Zedek. Who knows what that means? The Lord of righteousness. It's my Lord righteous, if you will. My Lord righteousness is what it means. And he's the king of Jerusalem. And let's see, I guess Ralphie pointed out this is the first time the word Jerusalem appears in Scripture. So, interesting enough. Jerusalem at this point, of course, wasn't a big city. It was just a town like most of the others around there. But anyway, it talks about him and how he, what was he concerned about? Why was he, as he saw that the Gibeonites had made the treaty with the Israelites, what was his big worry?
Well, it seemed like the Gibeonites were a major city and strong warriors, so that's someone that he couldn't count on right there in some ways, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Gibeonites had made a treaty with the Israelites, so now they were one team. And the Israelites had already been pretty significant fighters, and as you point out, the reputation for the Gibeonites was the same. And if you'll notice from the map, Jerusalem's not that far from Gibeon, and his thought was, my gosh, these guys are on a rampage and they're getting stronger. So, you know, this is not good. We should do something. So what was his solution? What did he decide he needed to do? Anybody have a thought about that?
Get all the other kings and
Yep.
attack.
Get some other kings and nip this thing in the bud, right? So he got 5 other, he and his people were, let's see, verse 3, he appealed to Hoham, the king of Hebron. Hebron is way down here. And then Piram, the king of Jarmuth. Some of these cities aren't on this map. Jarmuth, I think, is up in this somewhere. And then Japhia, king of Lachish, which is over here. And Debar, king of Eglon. Debar is both, seems to be a city, and there's Eglon and there's Debar. Anyway, he found some comrades, if you will, and he put them all together and made this team of 5 kings and their armies. And he said in verse 4, "Come up and help me attack Gibeon," he said, "because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites." So the 5 kings of the Amorites joined forces, and they moved up with their troops and took positions against Gibeon and attacked it. Now, all these cities were fortified cities, and when they attack a city, typically what they would do is they would surround it, They'd make sure they didn't have any water. They'd make sure they didn't have any food. And they'd hang around sometimes for 6 months or a year waiting for everybody to starve to death, which was a pretty miserable thing to have happen. But that was typically the way they did it. The Gibeonites sent word to Joshua, I'm in verse 6, and in the camp at Gilgal, because the Israelites were sitting around up here at Gilgal. That's where they were encamped during this time. And they said, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." Now, why would the Israelites be inclined to do this? Yeah, they made a treaty. In chapter 9, they made this treaty. They didn't really, when they found out that the Gibeonites deceived them, they weren't very happy about the treaty, but the treaty was the treaty. And they had made this commitment, so they had to honor the commitment. Now this next verse is good, verse 7. "So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, So all of the Israelites marched up, including the best fighting men. And Yahweh said to Joshua, 'Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you.'" Now that's a pretty big deal, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. The interesting thing there is it doesn't say that Joshua went to God and asked him about that. It just says that God said that. What do you think about that? Do you think God just basically came down one night and told him, he says, "What you're doing is the right thing. You go right ahead and do it because you're going to be successful"? Or do you think he went to God and sought guidance? There's not like a right or wrong answer here. I'm just asking what your thoughts are.
I would imagine he did this time, since
Yeah.
what just happened.
Yeah, he'd gotten kind of burned with the deal with the Gibeonites, right? And he's probably pretty sensitive to doing things without God's approval. So in any case, whether it's happened one way or the other, I like to kind of think he went to God and God blessed him almost
Yeah.
immediately with an answer and says, "Nope, this is a good deal, go for it." You're going to be successful. So in verse 9, "After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise." So the scouts in the region couldn't have seen them coming because they came at night. And it's not very far, as you can see, from Gilgal to Gibeon, really. So the whole entire army went up there at night, and they took them by surprise. And it says, Yahweh threw them into confusion before Israel, who defeated them in a great victory at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Haran and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. Makkedah is here, and so again, the maps doesn't have these other cities, but you can assume, I think, that the Israelites chased them, and they were busy running all the way down here, and as they caught them, they slew them, if you will. As they fled before Israel on the road from Beth Haran to Azekah, Yahweh hurled large hailstones down on them from the sky, and more of them died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. So what do you think about that?
The one thing I was thinking about that, the hailstone must be pretty condensed to take out. You know what I'm saying? If there's going to be hailstones, you have X amount of people, whatever. So if the hailstones did more damage, I'm just thinking in my head that it probably was more condensed as far as the stones coming down to do such a thing, and not kind of spread out.
Up in Colorado, eastern Colorado, and the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas, they're known for these hailstorms.
And they'd have to be pretty good size hailstones
They
to
have
take someone out.
A golf ball size hailstone is not unusual, and you hear about those all the time. But I've heard of snowball size hailstones, and that are softball, and and when they've got several thousand feet to come down, they're moving plenty fast, and I'm sure if you got hit in the head by one, it'd probably kill you. And as you say, hailstorms often are awfully localized, pretty small. And I'm not a bit surprised that if you had a nice severe hailstorm, you could knock out a whole bunch of people. If you didn't kill them by hitting them in the head, you'd probably break arms and legs.
Yeah.
So,
The only other, then again, I'd like to add to this, is
Mm-hmm.
a complete assumption. I was talking to Mark about this a couple of weeks ago, but they marched all night, and I'm just thinking, I know the desert is dark.
mm-hmm.
So I'm running on the assumption, since the sun stopped, right, and it talks about the moon, the only time I've ever seen the moon pretty much during the day, it's been pretty close to being full, where you recognize it. So I'm just guessing it was around that time that they were able to march all night under a light of like close to a full moon around that time period. Because if not,
They
little
trip over
torches,
stuff.
you're not going to move very
yeah.
fast, and you're not going to see much.
It
you
could
know?
be.
So,
It could very well be.
speculation.
That's fine. It is interesting that it points out that more soldiers were killed by the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. Because this is, I don't know, it reminds me of the time when Moses was crossing the Red Sea. And he said to the people, he said, just be still. And the Egyptians you see today, you'll never see again. God's going to take care of this. And they didn't have to do anything. They just, marched across the dry land that used to be the Red Sea. And at the other end, God did everything. And God's doing everything here pretty much. The Israelites' job was to basically break up the siege of Gibeon. And as they started running, God was in front of them, if you will, smashing them with hailstones and stuff. Pretty interesting, huh?
And that'd be what, I think the third time recorded that objects from the sky came down and took out people. Because you had the Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
you had something like debris coming down, and then the other was Sodom and Gomorrah, when they was taken out. So this is like, I think the third time mentioning not specific hailstones, but something
But some coming
down.
out, yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that an army could travel all night long and then start fighting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do very well without a good-sized breakfast and a good night's sleep myself.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So God was rather merciful to apparently think of them the way I do and came to their rescue even
Yeah.
without asking.
Good point. Good point. I was thinking, Ralphie's comment about things coming from the sky. I remember there have been many stories, all of them are anecdotal, about some of the stuff that went on when the Jews took back the land, the different wars that they've had over in Israel today. And some of those stories are pretty fascinating. They're not so much about things coming out of the sky, but I remember one of the big wars was, I think it was 67, where the Israelis basically just took back the entire Sinai Peninsula. They were on the edge of the eastern side of the Suez Canal, and they controlled all of that. The Israelis did. And they were against a greater number of tanks that the Egyptians had than the Israelis had. And they said that these tanks were stopping, and the soldiers were crawling out of the tanks and running back to Egypt. And they asked several of the soldiers, why did you do that? And they said, well, we saw this big angel in the sky, and it was really clear what was going on here, and we were afraid. So we just got up, left their tanks, and ran. And so, I guess stuff like this could still happen. Now, and you would expect that in our day and age, in our society, that would become nothing more than an anecdote. But I don't have much doubt that happened. There are a lot of stories like that in terms of the Israelis when they were taking the land back.
I was wondering, maybe Mark can look at it, but is the word hailstones, or could it be something like a meteor?
I don't know. That's a very good question.
What the reason I'm asking is because in Judges, let's see where I'm at, 5:20, it's interesting in light of what you just said. It lets us know that from the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. So it's interesting that even he tells us that, and in several places, like you've mentioned, we see the heavenlies that have been his army that has come at his bidding to do what he asks. So
Yeah,
that's interesting that
That is
he tells us
interesting.
the stars. So I was wondering if it may have been maybe
a
meteor
meteorite.
shower or a meteor or something that came down, and maybe not, because hailstones, I'm thinking like you mentioned, a thunderstorm.
Yeah. That makes even more sense with Sodom and Gomorrah. Because, you know, brimstone doesn't usually come from the sky, but if it were something like that, it would make sense. Well, that ties into what we're going to talk about next, because we're moving on here in chapter 12, or verse 12. It says, "On the day that Yahweh gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to Yahweh in the presence of Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down for about a full day, and there has never been a day before or since like it, when Yahweh listened to a man. Surely Yahweh was fighting for Israel." I want to talk about a couple of things. This is clearly a big deal, a unique thing. What do you think about the fact that God stopped the sun and the moon for Joshua? Do you think it really happened? Do you really think it happened? How do you think it happened? I mean, was there some I don't know what to say, some fact of nature or something that just happened? Or do you suppose God just literally suspended the mechanics of the universe for a day in order for this to happen? Do you suppose it was an exaggeration? Okay. Does it really happen? I shouldn't say, there was a time when I kind of struggled with this, because, you know, a lot of times whenever God's miracles are described in the Bible, you kind of want to say, well, that's just kind of exaggeration on the part of the guy that told the story. But, you know, there's no reason that God couldn't have done this. And when you get right down to it, there's no reason to doubt that he did. Go ahead.
You might get a little better idea on this if you take a look at the recently made documentary, The Principle. Have you heard of that?
No.
You should really watch it.
Okay, tell me about it.
It goes through the history of the study of the cosmic microwave background radiation, starting in 1965 when it was discovered by two scientists that ended up getting the Nobel Prize for discovering it. So what this documentary shows is that as they progressively studied this with more and more expensive equipment, getting more and more detailed results of this, and what it is low temperature radiation is diffused through the universe. And as they studied it, they found that it wasn't as uniform as they thought. They thought this was going to prove the Copernican principle, which is what this documentary is named after, which says that we're in Nowheresville. The Earth is not anywhere, is not in any special place. We're not anything special. The universe does not have an objective or a uniform frame of reference. And that's what most theoretical science is based on.
Yep.
What they found when they studied this, though, was that there was information imprinted into this radiation. And this information was basically Psalm 19, the heavens declaring the handiwork of God, because this information was saying that the earth was at the center of the universe, and that the entire universe rotates around the earth, and that the earth is motionless and stationary and doesn't move at all.
Really?
And this is called the cosmological crisis. And the axis that they found imprinted, this information, which is like an XYZ axis, and the origin point is the Earth. Not one of the billions of other stars or planets,
Yep.
just the Earth.
Just the Earth.
There's no information about anything else imprinted, just the Earth.
Okay.
And they call this axis the axis of evil.
Really? Now, what's the name of this documentary?
It's the principle.
The Principle.
And
Okay.
I purchased it. You'll get it on a DVD. If you go on the web, you can go onto their website and purchase it, and you get a DVD.
Okay.
And what it shows is that a lot of the science that we've got in our heads about the way the mechanics of the universe works is based on the Copernican principle, which has its roots back in Egyptian secret religions which is based on the worship of Helios, the sun god. So the Copernican solar system that we know about, where we're rotating around the sun, that is sun worship. It's all based on sun worship.
Okay, that's
As opposed to Ptolemy, that believed the universe was rotating around the earth.
Okay.
So,
Well, certainly,
so when you start looking at all of that, you suddenly realize it is very possible that the sun and the moon stopped. I mean, they literally stopped.
yeah,
And it didn't even require anything to do with the rest of the universe, because the biblical model is that the earth and that the sun and the moon rotate over the earth, above the plane of the earth.
okay, that's interesting. That's
So
interesting.
there's a lot of science now that's happening that's showing that it's verified. The experimental, data-driven science is showing that the Bible is telling the truth. God actually knows what he's talking about.
Okay, so that's kind of confirmation, if you will, that God really did do this. Certainly he could have. And I think that was the thing that impressed me, is when I finally realized, well, what's to say he didn't? What's to say he certainly could have. Jan has something.
But what he was saying was, I come across stuff like that where the earth is sitting, everything evolves around that. And it's like, I've read a lot on that
Yep.
as well. So,
Well, I'm rather amazed that the Bible is referring to a book out of Jasher.
Yes.
I think does that mean that Jasher is a more antique or antiquated book
I
than?
tell you, that's just great, because that's what I wanted to talk about. I brought the book of Jasher with me. And it turns out that the book of Jasher is referenced twice in the Bible. This is one of them, and the other one is, I think it's Samuel, but one of the Samuels.
yeah, around there.
And so the existence of the book is testified to by the Bible, if you will, by the Old Testament. But and there's a kind of a controversy here. There are no old copies of the book in existence. As a matter of fact, there were a whole lot of writings that were found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they found a lot of books, and a lot of them were books that aren't in the Bible. They were other writings and stuff, and they didn't find this book in the Dead Sea Scrolls either. And the earliest existing copies of the book are about 1600 AD. So on the one hand, that doesn't mean that it's not authentic, but it means that it's not provably authentic. The Torah, for example, well, the Old Testament in general, fragments were found of every book in the Old Testament with the exception of Esther at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and furthermore, they were found to be consistent with what we have today. So to me, right, I've always felt that there's not much literature in the world that is provably older than about 2,000 years, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are like 100 to 200 BC. So the Bible that we've got here is, I think, the most provably authentic document that we have. And the book of Jasher doesn't even come close to that, based on what's available in terms of looking back. On the other hand, there's probably a lot of stuff in here. There's certainly a lot of stuff in here that kind of fills in gaps and gives you some information that you don't get in the Bible. But this is just my opinion. My opinion is you read it and you consider it suspect. If it's consistent with the Bible, then you kind of say, well, okay, maybe. But if it's inconsistent with the Bible, then it's real clear which one's wrong. It's the one that's only 400 years old as opposed to the one that's 2,000 years old. Yeah.
I was just thinking, because, I mean, the book of Jasher just means what, of the upright. So it's not
Jasher,
a person's
yeah,
name,
that's a
just
good
the
point.
upright. And I'm just thinking, it's talking about something that happened here. Joshua being an upright person because Elohim answered him or did something for him. I'm wondering what, I know the other place, but what is it referencing?
The other one in
The other reference in
it was
Scripture.
some kind of a saying or a song, if you will, about teaching your children to use bow and arrows.
Mhm.
I went and read it, but
So-
I didn't keep it because I didn't think I'd talk about
I'm
it.
just
Go ahead.
curious to see, one, if there is a book out there, which obviously the scripture's referring to, but is it just a book, a list of people who are righteous, who are upright,
Yeah.
are doing stuff upright, where what we have today, the book of, might not be that exact book, because there's tons of other books out there that
Oh, yeah.
I've come across.
Well, there's
that are
several-
called the Book of the Upright, and they have
Yeah.
nothing to do with historical stuff at all.
That's a fair point. This one here is not necessarily, to put it another way, there are several books of Jasher. Yeah, and not one is not necessarily better than the other one. This one, for what it's worth, was based on the one that was printed in 1600. If you're interested, I did find exactly in here where it talks about this, and you can compare them. They're pretty much the same thing. Says, this book, chapter 88, says, "And they gathered themselves together, and the 5 kings of the Amorites went up with all their camps, a mighty people, numerous as the sand of the seashore. All these kings came and camped before Gibeon and began to fight against the inhabitants of Gibeon. And all the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua, saying, 'Come up quickly and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites have gathered together.' And Joshua and all the fighting men went up from Gilgal, and Joshua came suddenly to them and struck these 5 kings with a great slaughter. The Lord confounded them before the children of Israel, who struck them with a terrible slaughter in Gibeon, and pursued them all the way that goes to Beth-horon to Makkedah. They fled before the children of Israel, and while they were fleeing, the Lord sent on them hailstones from heaven, and more of them died by the hailstones than the slaughter of the children of Israel. The children of Israel pursued them and still struck them in the road, going on and smiting them. And when they were smiting them, the day was declining toward evening, and Joshua said in the sight of all the people, 'Sun, stand still on Gibeon, and you, moon, in the valley of Ajalon, until the nation shall have revenged itself on its enemies.' And God listened to the voice of Joshua, and the sun stood still in the midst of the heavens, and it stood still 36 moments." Now that's a little different, 36 moments, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And the moon also stood still in the whole day, and there was not a day like that before it or after it, that the Lord listened to a voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. I don't find anything in there much different than what we already had. So in this case, that doesn't add much.
Yeah.
But it is confirmation that at least that particular portion of the book of Jasher is consistent with what it says here. So I say, okay, fine. That, it proves something to me, but I don't know. Does anybody else have any comments on the book of Jasher that they want to say something about? Tanya says.
Kind of just a thought and a comment. Back to the sun and the moon. Yeah, stopping the sun and the moon for Yehoshua. It just brought me to a thought about, it's a scripture, I think it's Thessalonians, I'm not positive, where Yah tells us that he sped up life as we know it. Things that are happening, the earth, for all of us as well. It just makes me think how powerful and how awesome Yah is.
Okay, good. Well, let's see. I think if it's okay, I'll read on just another section, unless somebody wants to read. Does somebody want to read the next section of Joshua chapter 10?
Jan, do you have your hand up to read?
From verse 16 through verse 28. That'll probably be about all they'll do, but we can do that.
Now the 5 kings had fled and hidden in the cave at Makkedah. When Joshua was told that the 5 kings had been found hiding in the cave at Makkedah, he said, "Roll large rocks up to the mouth of the cave and post some men there to guard it. But don't stop. Pursue your enemies. Attack them from the rear, and don't let them reach their cities, for Yahweh your God has given them into your hand." So Joshua and the Israelites destroyed them completely, almost to a man, but the few who were left reached their fortified cities. The whole army then returned safely to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah, and no one uttered a word against the Israelites. Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me." So they brought the 5 kings out of the cave, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. When they had brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, "Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what Yahweh will do to all the enemies you are going to fight." Then Joshua struck and killed the kings and hung them on 5 trees, and they were left hanging on the trees until evening. At sunset, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had been hiding. At the mouth of the cave, they placed large rocks, which are there to this day. That day, Joshua took Makkedah. He put the city and its king to the sword and totally destroyed everyone in it. He left no survivors. And he did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho.
Okay. So after, as Joshua was being successful, they continued chasing these guys, and they basically destroyed the entire army. And so what did they do with the 5 kings? Where were these 5 kings? Yeah, they were hiding in a cave. So Joshua says, well, this is too easy, right? So he had big rocks rolled over the cave and says, we'll just leave them in there for a while till I figure out what I want to do, right? Then he went on, and they continued to destroy all the armies, and they did. Verse 20 says, so Joshua and the Israelites destroyed them completely, almost to a man. But the few who were left reached their fortified cities. Now, why do you suppose it was important that it happened this way? Let me ask you another question, put it another way. What would happen if he hadn't pursued them to destroy them before they reached their cities? They'd have gotten home, they'd have gone inside the city, they'd have closed the gates, and they'd have been there to defend it when Joshua and the Israelites finally got there. So I guess the point is, it was a whole lot easier to defeat these guys out in the open plain than it was whenever they got home. So that, to me, when that kind of dawned on me, I figured, well, sure, that's the way to do this. He wants to, the way to annihilate the army is when it's running. Heck, it's in disarray. To allow that opportunity to go away is not a good thing. And so that's what they did. What do you think it means in verse 21 when it says, this is Joshua and the Israelites destroyed them completely, almost to a man, but the few who were left reached their fortified cities. The whole army then returned safely to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah, and no one uttered a word against the Israelites. What do you think that means? Why do you think that's there? I'll put it that way. Nobody got any thoughts? I think they're basically, these guys are clearly, the biggest dog in the town. They're on top of their game, if you will. They've destroyed all their enemies, and far be it from anyone to say anything about their lack of ferocity or their lack of effectiveness or anything like that, because they're just, they're clearly number one. They just won the Super Bowl, so to speak. So what did Joshua do with the 5 kings?
He closed up the cave.
Yep. And then, and I'm down in verse 22.
Well, he held them there until
the armies were defeated.
Right.
The kings were gone, so their leaders were gone, if you will. Like I say, I'm sure that this was mostly a rout because there was not any effective leadership.
Right.
He had the kings brought out of the cave.
Right.
And he had them brought into the camp.
Right.
And what did he have his soldiers do? His commanders, his army commanders. Yeah, he said, put their foot on their necks. So that's a kind of, well, that's a typical thing to do, but it's also a strong metaphor, because if you're a man of war and some guy's got his foot on your neck, you're clearly not in any position to be fighting back. Were you going to say something, John?
Yeah. So I'm going to go a lot of symbology here.
Fine.
They talk about Yeshua. He was in a cave. They made a big deal about closing the cave up, right? He was executed. He was also put to death and put on a tree, which we haven't got to, verse 26.
That's fine.
And the name Joshua himself and Yeshua,
Yeah.
it's the same name. So there's a standalone Olav Tav that I've got set up, Mark. In verse 23. Oh. Anyway, there's a standalone Olav Tav, and a lot of people think that's symbolic of Yeshua. He says,
Yep.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, but in the Hebrew that would be the Olive and the Tav. And in this chapter, there's only one, what I would call a standalone Olav Tav, and it's in verse 23, and it's talking about the king of Jerusalem is, in the Hebrew, is standalone Olav Tav, Melech Yerushalayim.
That's King of Jerusalem,
King of Jerusalem, right. So,
and then Olive Tav.
right. So I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, the King of Yeshua being what the Olive Tav really is, or what it represents symbolically, I'll
Right.
say, is the King of Jerusalem.
Right.
Cool.
Oh, one thing, Jerry, you asked why what was that question about?
Why did
No
they?
one say anything?
Yeah.
I think maybe one reason why, I think it's the beginning of 9, if I remember right, all the kings with one, and all the people came with one accord or with one mouth against Israel. So maybe that's a follow-up
That could
to
be.
that.
Yep. Yep.
Now they have no mouth.
They had nothing
They
to
ain't
say.
talking now.
That's a very good point. That's a good one.
I heard a sermon recently on this matter of why they didn't just kill them. They brought shame to them because in that culture, in that society, if you beheaded them or killed them and then hung them on a stake, you not only shamed them, but their whole family then would be considered shamed. And Yeshua took our shame on the cross as well.
Good point. That's a very good point.
And that's interesting,
Yep.
because cursed is a man who hangs on the stake.
Yep.
So, I mean, I just see, for me, and again, this is a little picture I saw. It's like, okay, you had these 5 kings put on a stake, dead, and then put into a tomb, basically into a cave with their
Yep.
stones rolled away.
Yep.
That's no different than what happened to Messiah. So
Yep.
I see it as like, okay, this is let's say, coming down and serving judgment. Now, when Messiah shows up, the world has its revenge, so to speak.
Yeah.
Puts Messiah on a stake, put him in a tomb, but yet he didn't stay, obviously.
Yep.
Was there a hand up over here?
That's what you were saying, John, right? Okay.
Okay, while Ralphie's doing that, I think there's a practical application that we see in this if we look carefully. It probably speaks to us today. That we read in the beginning of the chapter that the Father told him, I'm going to give this army to you, so go ahead, as you mentioned, go forth and do this. But he had to do something. He could not just, it wasn't going to happen without manpower, without putting forth an effort. So the Father promises, I'm going to provide, I'm going to give this to you, but now we need to seek direction. What do we have to do? What is our part?
Yep.
For them, they had to go forth and slay the men.
Yep.
And this probably wasn't an easy task. Like Pat mentioned, they had to travel all night and then pursue them the next day. Look how, on the map, how far you showed us that they had to chase these men. This was lots of effort on our man's part that he had to exert, even though the Father said, I'm going to give them to you,
Yeah.
but you have to do your part.
You know, that's the second time in just the past couple of days that someone has pointed that out. When God tells us we're going to be successful, that doesn't mean we get to sit back and not do anything. You have to work at it. I'll put it this way, and it may be wrong. You have to work at it as if it depended on you even though you know God's going to make you successful. But I think that's in general something you need to remember, because it's not very often that he just comes, you're not expecting it, and he comes off and just does this amazing miracle right in front of you. He does do that, and he certainly can. But we have our part to play. That's a good point.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. You're a blessed people, so go out and become blessed.
Yeah.
Go do.
Yeah. So you wanted to point that out up here?
Yeah.
I just got the pointer. Ralphie's doing that.
No, I didn't touch it.
I can't do that with this. I'm not supposed to be able to. I'm so sorry. Where is it? Excuse me. I won't touch it again. All I was supposed to be doing, this is just the laser, is all it is.
Maybe you're hitting the other side.
No. It's my day to have computer problems.
It's the new Windows 10.
Yeah, that's what it is, that
Let's
new
blame it on
Windows
that.
10, yeah. There's an olive
Yeah,
top.
that's it.
Yep. And there's Melech over
And
to the
Melech's
left of
the
it,
next one. Yeah.
and Jerusalem to the left of that. Now, I'm afraid to show it now with my little button. But where the arrow is there's the olive tav. And then, well, I don't think I am. Well, no, I did it, see, I blew it up because I pressed it once. Anyway, I'm sorry, John. I don't have a mouse. Okay, I can't do this. This doesn't work. We got to quit here in a second, but that's okay. It's fine. Okay, we're running over anyway. I think I'm going to quit and say that since we didn't finish chapter 10, we'll obviously pick up and do chapter 10, complete it next week, huh?
Okay.
Okay. If any final thoughts? Okay, well, I'll just close in prayer. Father God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the thought processes that it makes us go through, because it all serves to help us understand more fully who you are and how great you are, how much you love us, and how wonderful your word is. I just ask that you'd keep us safe until we meet together next week. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Thank you,
Okay,
Jerry.
we'll start again at 3? So that's about 20 minutes from now.